Today, we'll talk about why and how to use EUROSTUDENT microdata. And we'll also hear about what are some examples of how it's already been done. I'm Elisabeth Kendrali from Praxis in Estonia. And with me here today, we've got Silvia Mandl and Joris Fubo. And hi, Silvia. Hi, Joris. And a few words about today's speakers. Silvia, she holds a PhD in socioeconomics and is working for the Higher Education Research Group at the Institute of Advanced Studies in Austria since 2019. And she focuses on international projects like EUROSTUDENT. And Joris is a senior researcher at ResearchNet. ResearchNet is based in the Netherlands. And Joris has been doing policy research on education since 2015, and he has a background in sociology and human geography. And both Institute for Advanced Studies and ResearchNet are part of the EUROSTUDENT Consortium. And then in today's webinar, we first let Silvia and Joris talk a little bit about the microdata, and then leave some time for a discussion too. If there aren't any more questions at this moment, and everyone, or well, we can't know if everyone has joined us already, but quite many people. I'll hand it over to you, Silvia and Joris.
Thank you. So good afternoon, everybody. Basically, there will be two parts in this presentation. First off, I will give you more information on the scientific use file of EUROSTUDENT. And afterwards, Joris shows you some examples of how microdata of EUROSTUDENT 7 was previously used to inspire you for your own research. So most of you might already know EUROSTUDENT collects data on the social dimension of European higher education. And since last round, so round 7, several countries also offer their microdata. So the data is available in a scientific use file. This scientific use file is basically free of charge, so you do not have to pay for it. And for round 7, so the last one, which took place between 2018 and 2021, the scientific use file is already available now. And for the current round, round 8, it will be available in 2024. So what would be interesting for us at this point is one question that will be shown to your screen like in a few seconds. Have you already heard about EUROSTUDENT microdata before this EUROSTUDENT Talk webinar? I know many of the names who are visiting this talk, but let's see.
I'll give it a bit more. I see some people are answering still. Oh, and I see the results already.
It's fine, you can share it.
And let's see.
Okay, so a lot of you already have heard about it, 77%. That's good. That means that we're promoting it okay. But to give you more information about it, the difference to the last rounds where we only offered aggregated data is that the microdata allows you the use of more advanced statistical analysis. And for EUROSTUDENT, we have many topics covered. So the data allows you to take a closer look at, for example, students' backgrounds, living and study conditions, international mobility, students' budget, money-wise and time-wise. So you can really focus on one of these aspects and analyze it in more depth with the microdata. And in the current round, so in round 7, there is also something new, which is that there is also 4 special topical modules covered that will only be asked for one round. Recording stopped. Okay. The data is intended for higher education researchers on the one hand, and researchers and non-profit organizations from other fields as well. However, the data is not available for non-scientific profit purposes like market research. So now, as all of you for sure immediately want to get the scientific use file, this is what you have to do for it. You have to register, which means you have to type in your name, your email address, your postal address, and decide on a password. You basically select the data. You fill in your position. For example, if you're a student, if you're research assistant, whatever. And then give some information on your project, so the project title, description of your research, the methods, the usage period, and the project scope, which can be for teaching, for a seminar paper, research project, and so on. Then you just have to check your application and submit, and that's it. So it's really easy to apply and to get this data. And where can you find it? You can now use the QR code if you want to, or you can also use the link to get it. We would now, in this presentation, continue with examples of usage of microdata from round 7. But if there are questions on the practicalities of the microdata or the scientific use file, you can ask them now already.
Could you please, Silvia, also tell us that should researchers take into consideration some kind of possible delays in receiving it, or like when they apply, it's not automatic, right? When they
yeah, it is not automatic, but it should be done in I don't know, 5 work days or something. So for most research projects, a short amount of time.
Okay.
And it does not need to be like loads of information. You do not have to write an essay on the research you're planning, but give sound information on that.
And to add one more thing, so we had different releases of the data. First time with 14 countries, and then adding some countries afterwards. So now we have more than 220,000 students within the data file.
Okay. So even more. Any other questions right now? Yeah, you're already curious for examples, right? Okay. Then I hand over to Joris.
Right. Yeah, so the first example, we looked into the obstacles for international mobility for European students. Because in the EUROSTUDENT 7 questionnaire, there are 11 obstacles, and we tried to reduce the number to get some easier insights in which obstacles students have for going abroad. So we did some exploratory factor analyses, and on the next slide, you can see in the left column, there are the separate individual obstacles, and you can see the results in the second and third column. So we did a factor analysis, and you can see that the first 4 rows together, they combine one factor. We called it practical obstacles, because compared to the other 2, you see there are separation from social circle and separation from partner and children. We dubbed the second factor the social obstacles. So we have a factor practical obstacles and a factor social obstacles. And but you can also see that in the bottom 5 rows, there are different items which don't belong to either one of those. And when you look at those, you can see, yeah, kind of makes sense. For instance, health or a disability, yeah, would be less related to the others. But whereas being separated from your social circle or your being separated from your partner, children would be more related. Same goes for a foreign language, for instance. And as a second step, we looked in the next slide, we looked how these scores vary for countries. So you can see on the x-axis, there's the practical obstacles, and they're standardized scores. So the mean is 0 here for the total of all students. And on the y-axis, you see the social obstacles. And a higher score, which could be counterintuitive, but in this graph, the higher score means that they are less of an obstacle. So in the top right, you see the Danish students. So they have less practical obstacles and have less social obstacles. Whereas for Poland, goes the opposite. They report more practical and more social obstacles. But this graph also shows that, for instance, we look a bit more to the left, because it's clear they are, yeah, you can draw a line in between. So there's some relation between reporting these obstacles. But you can also see that for Croatia, for instance, they report less of the social obstacles, but relatively more practical obstacles. Whereas for Finland or also Estonia, for instance, they report the opposite. So relatively less of the practical obstacles, but more social obstacles. And for the third graph, or the third slide on this matter, we then looked within the countries for the differences between age groups. And well, for social obstacles, you would expect that at least the higher students report more social obstacles, of course, because they, yeah, more likely to have children, for instance. But you can see that this varies, well, especially the practical obstacle part. It varies for countries. So for instance, in Austria, you see that the younger students report more practical obstacles, whereas in Denmark, for instance, it's quite equal. So we see different patterns. So this is one example, and was more of a exploratory analysis done, and the whole point was also to show the possibilities of the EUROSTUDENT 7 data. But of course, it could be interesting to also look for the relationship between the social and practical obstacles with, for instance, the language skill part, which wasn't included here, or the financial obstacles for students. So, well, there could be many more related research questions to this. So the second example is the student social integration. We did this research for a thematic review, which was also reported which was published in 2021. And we looked at the factors contributing to student social integration at their higher education institutions and how it varied for countries. And also thought it could be perhaps mitigated by the students being dependent on student grants. So there were 4 questions indicating the student social integration. and they were, let me see, whether students knew other students to discuss subject-related questions, having contact with students in the study program, getting along with lecturers, and lecturers being interested in what the students have to say. So there are two components in these. So one of them is student-student contact, and the other one is student-teacher contact. And theoretically, we base this on Tinto's model on socioacademic integration and its adaptations. So in the next graph, you can see our theoretical model. So we have the social background influencing the students' resources, and the students' resources being cultural capital or economic capital or social capital, based on Bourdieu. And the students' resources can lead to, they can have a direct effect on the social integration to the other students and the lecturers. But it can also, through, at least that was our expectation, through the time spent on work and the time spent on studies, could also have an indirect effect on the social integration. In the next graph, you can see the results of the logistic regression model, with the dependent variable being integrated with fellow students. So this is one of the two dependent variables we looked into. So this is just a graphical representation of the logistic regression model. So you can see the dark colored bars indicate significant, statistically significant effect, and the score of 1 to 0 means that they have a negative effect. 1 being no effect, and higher than 1 indicates a positive effect. So for instance, you can see that female students report a bit less contact with fellow students. Younger students indicate more contact. Students with a migration background and international students indicate less contact. And for the socioeconomic background, for us, surprisingly, we saw that the parental education did not have any effect. But the parental financial situation did have a clear effect, showing that students who are not well off with less money in their family indicated lower social integration. Yeah, you can see in the graph there are many other factors showing this, as well as the for the working hours. You can see that students who have medium or high working hours compared to low working hours indicate more social integration, but also students who have a higher study intensity, which means that they spend more time studying, also report higher integration to students, as one would expect, since the students probably are more in the university, etc. At the bottom part, you can also see the field of study, which we more used as a control variable. So in the next slide, we also ran the regression models for different countries. Then you see varying effects. For the study intensity, it's more clear. So for basically all the countries, you can see a positive effect of studying medium or high intensity. Only Georgia is an exception here. For working hours, it's yeah, it varies. For some countries, there's no effect. For some, for Denmark and Georgia, students with high working hours report less social integration. And in the next slide, we also looked at the social economic background of the students separately for the participating countries. And I forgot to mention, these are also the outcome of the logistical regression models based on the same model as you saw before. So here you also see varying effects. For most countries, you see at least students with parents who are not well off, so the lowest category, report less social integration. But we also see that for the parental education, as we saw for the main model, for most countries, it doesn't matter, surprisingly, which also contradicts the Tinto model and all their predecessors. And on the next slide, oh yeah, this is a different study. This is based on the EUROSTUDENT 8 data. And yeah, currently I only have access to the Dutch data, so we're missing at least 16 other countries. But this is another example because what you see here you see the mean scores for different student groups. And for the score on the x-axis, you see it's called negative impact COVID-19 pandemic on study outcomes. So for this, we used one of the topical modules from EUROSTUDENT 8. And there were questions on what students thought that COVID-19 did on different outcomes. But some of them were also, we also did a factor analysis on this, and there clearly was one, at least on the Dutch data, one study outcome factor. So I think, look at this different items. So for instance, the duration of their studies, the grades, and the knowledge and skills they learned at that point. So that's on the x-axis, and the higher score means that they report more negative impact of the COVID-19 pandemic. And on the y-axis, you see the well-being of students, and that's based on a different topical module, the mental health and well-being topical module. And the basis of that is 5 questions on students, whether they felt well rested and things like that. And we combine those scores in on this, it's called the WHO5 score, and basically means the higher the score, the less mental health problems, or they have a better well-being. So what can you read in this graph? For instance, that there also seems to be quite some relation between having a negative impact of COVID-19 and well-being. And for some students, we see that they score low on both parts, and others on high on both outcomes. And for me, the most striking was the financial difficulties, since they're on the outer skirts of the graph. So we see in the top left, students without financial difficulties, they report to be more happy or have a better well-being, and they had least negative impact of COVID-19 on their study outcomes. And on the opposite, on the bottom right, we see that students with more financial difficulties report more negative impact of COVID-19 pandemic on their study outcomes, and also say they have a lesser well-being. For other factors, there seem to be less differences, but also a migration background. We can see that for those first generation and second generation migrants, we relatively report more negative outcomes of COVID-19, and also report that they are more unhappy. So this would be interesting. Well, I will look into this further for next week for the researchers conference, but I think it would also be interesting to look into this and to see differences between countries for these relationships. And luckily, we will have micro-student aid data, so everyone is able to do so. I think we can go to the next slide.
So the next slide is already about the next step. So this would be the point where you can ask any questions regarding those examples Joris just gave.
I just wanted to note that I think this is a great way of visualizing the different student groups on two different variables at the same time. So thanks for that. It's a good idea.
Thanks.
And maybe also a question for if we have any Danish or Danish people or people from Georgia here, because you mentioned that when you looked at the interaction, the integration, the social integration of students, you know, the patterns were a bit different in Denmark and Georgia, that whereas in other countries, working hours or higher working hours predicted better social integration than it was the other way around in Denmark and Georgia. So I just wonder if it could, and I read the report, and there you explained that the higher working hours predicting social integration might come from the fact that students also interact with other students at their workplaces because their jobs are just like that. It's a catering job or something else like this. Then I was wondering if the jobs are different in Denmark and Georgia that the students do, or if there's anyone who could comment on it here, or what do you think, maybe, Joris?
Hi, I'm from Georgia. I don't know if anyone except me is from Georgia. So it's very interesting, but unfortunately, I don't have this data before. I mean, I didn't have, and I didn't analyze yet in this direction. So it's difficult to explain the results right now, but I think we can work together, if you don't mind, if you agree, and we can, I think it should be several explanations, but I don't have, to be honest, I don't have any idea now.
So it's not clear that Georgian students have very different types of jobs where they for sure don't interact with other students. This is not the case in Georgia then.
Yes, exactly. So I think we need to dig deeper, and maybe it's not so easy to understand all this. So I don't have right now the answer.
Thank you.
but results are very interesting, and yes, it's a really great example how we can analyze data. And if I may, I ask one question. Can I? Do you use SPSS program or done in some other program? I mean, R or maybe Excel or?
Yeah, all the graphs were made with R.
Okay.
But for the analysis, I used SPSS as well. So both. Yeah, the EUROSTUDENT 7 scientific use files available in SPSS and Stata format.
We generally use SPSS, but these graphs are really amazing. I think it's visualization is very important. And yes. Thank you.
Just to clarify this technical question also, that they're available in Stata and SPSS files, but this also means they can be imported to R and they can be used in other softwares too.
Yeah, I don't have any experience with SAS, which would be the third family, but at least, yeah, in R you can also load it, load the data.
To be honest, my interest to participate in this webinar is that we are planning to organize webinars in Georgian language to send of all this information and spread all this information about microdata and EUROSTUDENT in our society, I mean scientific society. So for me, it's very interesting, and I hope to receive this presentation, if it's possible, afterwards. So, if I may, I will copy your not directly, but some way how to present examples in Georgian, because I think it's very important to use this data, and we'll have our webinars in early fall, I think. So
great to hear that there's already very direct plans of spreading the information in Georgia too.
Yes, because I always shocked when I ask to my students, do you hear about EUROSTUDENT or EUROSTUDENT microdata? And even among my students, I received quite high percentage of no. So I think webinars will help us to raise awareness of our students and professors and researchers about EUROSTUDENT project and how they can use the data. So I think we need to write and present step-by-step instruction how to use, how to ask, how to fill in this presentation and application, and how to receive this access to data, and as well to show them how then they can use, and how huge is this opportunity for scientific research. So
yeah, and one thing we added to the EUROSTUDENT 8 microdata, or will add. So EUROSTUDENT 7 is only available in a scientific use file, and you have to apply for it individually. But for the EUROSTUDENT 8, there will also be a campus use file. So teacher, and it means that it has a higher, it's more anonymized.
Higher visibility.
No, it's the anonymization is made more extensive. So, but the advantage of it is that teachers are allowed to share it with their students. So that would also increase the awareness of EUROSTUDENT microdata.
I see. It will be great, I think, for our project. Thank you for that.
Is there any other questions on the presentation of yours, on the visualizations also? Otherwise, we are also interested in your research or what you're planning or what you're thinking to do with the data. So if Elizabeth can already use the tool. So first off, have you already used the data before?
Now I'm thinking that they should have actually asked this before the webinar and afterwards to see the effect of the webinar. Okay, let's see what two people think.
Mm-hmm. Okay, so there's 19% who have already used it. That's very good and interesting. And further 38% who plan to do it. So I hope those people got more information of today. And
I would just also like to add that using here, I'm not sure what everybody had in mind that using personally as a researcher, because I know that we also have some policymakers here, but you could also think about using in the sense of perhaps commissioning research that uses EUROSTUDENT microdata, or using it with your students, having your students use it for their dissertations, or yeah, depending on who you are and where do you work.
so can you put in the next question, please?
Yes, just a second.
Yeah, and that would be interesting for us, of course, because you've seen there is many topics. Maybe you don't know yet, then just leave it empty. But if you're already researching on a specific topic, or you want to use the data in a specific way, for us, it's of course good to know which topics there, and maybe you will realize other researchers that are already working in your field.
Maybe you could even put back the slide which showed the
Yeah,
different modules. And then also that we will have the new modules for the EUROSTUDENT 8 microdata as well.
Yeah, these are those ones.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah,
Okay.
and sorry, one more thing to add on the topical modules, because there is a possibility that they will also be included in EUROSTUDENT 9, I think, but maybe not. Perhaps
I wouldn't promise that at this point.
Yeah. So at least COVID-19 would be less relevant, I hope.
So let's see what people are interested in.
Is there any way we can
Yeah,
see the
actually
results?
I can see them on the Zoom page. You can't see them right now on the screen, right?
No, we can't.
I'll just read out some. So we have people interested in mental health, in access and transition, also in the sense of belonging in higher education. So Joris, you were inspiring. There's also people interested in the housing situation, dropout intentions, more mental health. So several people interested in mental health, time budget and finances, and also in the socioeconomic inequalities in study abroad participation and the influence of COVID and the influence of the war in Ukraine. So very, very interesting topics here, I think.
Thank you. And I think the last question you wanted to just ask.
Yeah, so just to kick off the general Q&A or give more space to you as the audience to clarify anything that maybe remained unclear, is there anything that you are missing now regarding using or accessing the microdata? Would you like to clarify something with Sylvia and Joris? I think it was pretty clear, so I totally get if there's nothing to clarify. And this can, Sylvia, maybe you could also remind us that if we now want to see these steps again, then the slides, we will share them, right? We can put them on the EUROSTUDENT Talk page on, so the EUROSTUDENT web page where the EUROSTUDENT Talks information is at. So we will share also the webinar recording and the slides where you can see all the steps of applying for the data.
And you can also see our email addresses here. So if some questions after this talk come up, you can always email us. Malene, do you have a question? You just opened your video.
Yes, actually, I have one question. I assume that you can see who has asked out the microdata from you, and have you somehow tracked or tried to monitor for what topics researchers have been using the data?
Yeah, so our colleagues of the research data center, they can see, well, they have to approve, but I don't have the latest number of requests being made. And I know they also have these automated alerts that if people publish something, yeah, they should reference the microdata, and they get an overview of that. But of course, there's no guarantee that people actually do the proper, make the proper reference.
So hopefully, perhaps on one day we can have someone presenting some research here based on the microdata.
Yeah, definitely. And I think EUROSTUDENT 8, of course, will only be more attractive. Also, if you can do longitudinal analyses. So.
And also on the official EUROSTUDENT website, so EUROSTUDENT EU, you can find all the research that was done by ourselves with EUROSTUDENT data, also from the previous round. So it's mostly on aggregated data, but still you get an overview of the topics that were worked on already.
I would also like to add this call for everyone who maybe know about any articles published using it, or maybe it hasn't reached the EUROSTUDENT consortium, that EUROSTUDENT microdata has been used somewhere. So really feel free to reach out and maybe we can share your results, or perhaps your students have used it, even if it's not a published article. Or so all these examples are very welcome. And like we saw today, it can really also inspire other people too. I was also wondering regarding the data that you showed some factor structures that you analyzed with a microdata, and I was wondering that, so if I as a researcher I took the whole data set and I got the questionnaire probably also with the data, so I see what were the questions, right? But because a lot of the items are developed based on already validated scales and theoretical models, so I would be very happy to know about the factor structures of the several items. Is this information also there?
Yeah, I mean, there's a lot of so on the metadata website where you can access the data. There's a data and methods report. So, for instance, you can see response rates per country, things like that. But yeah, I'm not sure for the different factor scores. Well, for the validated factor scores, which if they do need to be referenced properly, which maybe I didn't do just now, but that's in the report, and you can find it there.
Okay, so there is some help, some guidance on that how to build the factor structure.
But for instance, the obstacles for international mobility, that's just own research. So of course you could use it, but you can easily do the analysis yourself, or if you want any differences, a different focus, you should do your own analysis, of course.
Any other questions from the participants? You can also write them in the chat if you wouldn't like to open your microphone just right now. I was also curious about that, working on the microdata already. You mentioned that perhaps some next steps could be looking at the financial obstacles regarding international mobility, but are there any other topics or questions that you really look forward to exploring yourself, Sylvia and Joris?
Yeah, so I was interested in what I showed in the last graph, at least the well-being outcome, and also look at different factors which can influence that. But I think for your student would also be interesting to see how it varies between the countries, or and within the countries. So do we see differences for each group, for each country? So that would be at least one focus. And also next year there will be an additional EUROSTUDENT report based on the microdata. So there's a high probability it will be on that topic.
Anything you would like to add, Sylvia?
Yeah, I'm really curious about the data on discrimination and mental health that is upcoming from this round. So because it's something we haven't asked around before in that depth. So yeah, it's going to be interesting what the results will be here, and to also have a comparison between countries and see how specific groups react to those issues.
Yeah, I agree.
But yeah, with so many covered topics, yeah, of course, probably if you think half an hour about some research questions, you'll end up with several of them. So if only there was a limited number of time, then you could do a lot more research.
But that's why we're having the webinar here, so that everyone can also get inspired and get data and spread it with their colleagues and students. So if we share this among a lot of researchers, then maybe we really get to answer a lot more questions. Yeah,
I think a good start, if you want to have a look at one of those topics in more depth, is to have a look at the data and find out which questions were asked specifically, and then build your research question around that. So I think that's a good way to do it.
Yeah, and also at the metadata site, which we can also post a link. You can already access the metadata. So for that, you don't have to wait for any approval. So you can already see the data method reports, for instance.
So just to wrap it up, maybe to remind anyone who now got interested in using the EUROSTUDENT 8 data or the new modules on discrimination experiences or mental health, when was it that they could maybe access the microdata of EUROSTUDENT 8? When can we expect that?
Yeah, that will be next year. Because we have to collect the data, anonymize it, and harmonize it, so combine it. So probably somewhere between May and August 2024. Probably it will be made available during the researchers conference, or the final conference of EUROSTUDENT. So then the EUROSTUDENT 8 data will be made available. And as I said, the EUROSTUDENT 7 data, we've had 3 versions, and the version we put out online last week, that will be the final version for this. So with the 17 countries and the 220,000 students. And I put a link to access it also in the chat.
Thank you, Joris. So now everyone knows that it's about time to start developing the research plans and the analysis plans, because data, or the new data, is not here yet, but there's plenty of time to maybe even work on the analysis plan, because the metadata is there. I want to thank everyone for joining in, and like usually, you can re-watch today's webinar at the eurostudent.eu/talks, where it will be uploaded soon with the slides. And I hope we managed to inspire some of you to conduct research using the microdata, or commission such research, or if you're working in academia, maybe suggest it to your students. And if I'm right, you can expect the next webinar in a month's time.
Yes, I can actually add that it should be 11th of May, and our French colleagues will introduce some of their research. So
Great.
So
soon.
what time it will be?
11th of May, and usual timing. This 11 CET.
This time?
11 CET as usually.
Yes, as usually I have a lecture this time.
But
Today is
we
exception.
will record.
It's thank you. But today is exception, and as usually I have this time lecture, and unfortunately.
So this shows that sometimes it's good to also have it on other times. And
yes.
Yeah. And if you want to receive all the information about the next webinars too, then you can register for the webinars newsletter, which is also at, I think, eurostudent.eu/talks. And then you get all the information about the next webinars as well.
Of course, sure.
So thank you everyone again.
And at our Twitter as well, so you can see it in both places.
Exactly. All right. See you everyone at the next webinar.
Thank you, everyone. Thank you, Silvia.
Thank you.